The massive crystal chandeliers of Nexus Station cast rainbow patterns across polished marble floors as thousands of beings from across the galaxy gathered for the greatest celebration in galactic history. The air hummed with translators working overtime, converting dozens of languages into a symphony of victory. Ambassador Keller of the Vorthan Alliance adjusted his ceremonial armor one final time, and the weight of 7 years of war finally lifting from his shoulders. His reflection in the polished walls showed a being transformed by conflict. The scales that had once gleamed silver now bore the dull patina of stress and sleepless nights. But today none of that mattered. Today the Dominion Empire had finally fallen. "Ambassador," his aide Nestra whispered, her tentacles coiling with nervous energy. "The humans never acknowledged our victory broadcast. 3 months of complete silence from Earth." Keller's laugh rumbled through his chest like distant thunder. The humans waved a dismissive claw. They withdrew from the conflict the moment things got difficult, claimed neutrality when we needed them most. Typical behavior from a species that evolved on a single world. You know what's funny about assumptions? They have a way of coming back to bite you when you least expect it. The great assembly hall stretched before them like a cathedral of victory. Representatives from 23 worlds filled the space, their diverse forms creating a living tapestry of galactic unity. The crystalline hegemony's delegates sparkled like living diamonds. The fungal collective spores drifted in carefully contained atmospheric bubbles. Even the warlike predator clans had sent their fiercest warriors to witness this moment. But it wasn't just a celebration, it was a division of spoils. The Dominion's former territories were being carved up like a feast. Mining rights to the mineral-rich Outer Rim, control of the lucrative hyperspace trade routes, the industrial complexes that had once fed the Dominion's war machine now belonged to the victors. Peace treaties were signed with ceremonial flourish, each signature marking another nail in the Dominion's coffin. The irony was almost perfect. Almost because, while the galaxy celebrated peace, somewhere in the depths of space, a lone ship moved through the void with deadly purpose. The Retribution was nothing special to look at, a modified destroyer-class vessel, scarred by years of service. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, his weathered face illuminated by the cold light of distant stars. His hands gripped the railing with white-knuckled intensity as he watched the celebration broadcasts flooding the communication channels. Every species in the galaxy was represented in those images. Every species, except one. The humans had been forgotten. Again, Morrison's reflection in the viewport showed a man carved from granite and grief. Gray streaked his dark hair and lines mapped decades of hard decisions across his face. His blue eyes, once bright with hope, now burned with something far more dangerous purpose. "Captain," his communications officer called out. "We're receiving another celebration broadcast from Nexus Station. Should I know?" Morrison's voice cut through the bridge chatter like a blade. "I've seen enough." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Every member of Morrison's crew had lost someone. Every human who had survived the war carried the same burden. The memorial wall in the ship's central corridor told the story better than any history book ever could. Names covered every surface not carved in stone, but etched in light so they would never fade. The display cycled through faces and stories, a digital graveyard of humanity's sacrifice. There, in the center, glowed the faces that haunted Morrison's dreams. Emma Morrison, xenobiologist and lover of alien cultures. Her smile had once lit up entire rooms. Lucy Morrison, age 8, who had wanted to be a starship captain like her daddy. Their final message to him, recorded moments before the Alliance. Bombardment turned New Denver Colony into radioactive glass, played on repeat in his nightmares. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Lucy's voice echoed in his memory. He never got to answer that question. 47 million souls? That was the final count. 47 million human lives erased from existence while the galaxy fought over territory and resources. Men, women, children, elderly, all reduced to acceptable losses in someone else's war. The truly maddening part? It could have been prevented. The human colonies had been clearly marked as neutral territory. They had no military value, no strategic importance. They were research outposts, agricultural settlements, and family homes. The kind of places where children played in alien gardens and scientists made discoveries that benefited everyone. But neutral territory means nothing when you're standing on valuable resources. Morrison's fingers traced the edge of his daughter's photo. Lucy would have been 15 now. She would have been starting her academy applications, dreaming of exploring the stars. Instead, she was a name on a wall, a casualty in a war that supposedly ended 3 months ago. The War Crimes Tribunal had been thorough, they claimed, every atrocity documented, every criminal sentenced, justice served with galactic precision. But somehow, 47 million dead humans had been classified as administrative oversights, paperwork errors, clerical mistakes, not genocide, never genocide. Sir Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh stepped beside him, her own grief carefully controlled. Walsh had lost her entire family on Kepler 4 for to be. The crew was ready for final approach. Morrison nodded, his decision crystallizing like steel cooling in space. The Alliance celebrated victory while our people's ashes were still warm. They carved up the galaxy like a prize turkey while human children's screams still echoed in the void. He turned to face his crew, seeing his own pain reflected in their eyes. These weren't soldiers, not really. They were teachers, engineers, farmers, and shopkeepers who had watched their worlds burn while the galaxy looked the other way. They think the war is over, Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. They think they can celebrate peace while our dead go unacknowledged. They think humanity will just disappear into the history books as a footnote to their glorious victory. The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of the ship's engines. They're about to learn something every human child knows from the cradle, Morrison said, his smile cold. As the space between stars, we don't forget, we don't forgive, and we never, ever let genocide go unpunished. He moved to the captain's chair, settling into it like a throne of judgment. Set course for Nexus Station, maximum burn. It's time they learned the truth about what happens when you try to erase humanity from existence. The Retribution altered course, its engines flaring to life with deadly purpose. Behind them, the memorial wall continued its eternal vigil, 47 million names bearing witness to what was about to unfold. The war, as the aliens understood it, was indeed over. But humanity's reckoning was just beginning. The galaxy was about to discover that some victories come with a price that compounds over time. It's much like the interest on a debt that's been ignored for too long. Speaking of the power of compounding, there's another story worth exploring about how small actions can build into world-changing forces. Check out my next video about the incredible power of compounding and how it shapes everything from personal growth to galactic justice. The proximity alarms that shattered the peace of Nexus Station at 0400 hours weren't just any ordinary warning system. These were the kind of alarms that made seasoned space traffic controllers break out in cold sweats and reach for emergency protocols. The sound cut through the station's artificial night cycle like a plasma torch through steel. Jerking thousands of sleeping beings from their dreams, traffic controller Yimex had been monitoring the outer perimeter for 12 years without a single unscheduled arrival. His multiple eyes, each adapted to track different spectrums of light, blinked in rapid succession as he stared at readings that defied everything he knew about space traffic patterns. The object approaching wasn't following any known flight. Path wasn't transmitting any recognized beacon codes, and most disturbing of all, it was moving fast enough to suggest either extreme urgency or hostile intent. Computer run full sensor sweep, Yemex commanded, his forearms dancing across multiple control panels simultaneously. Cross-reference with all scheduled arrivals and diplomatic missions. The response came back in that emotionless tone computers use when delivering bad news. No matches found. Unknown vessel approaching on intercept course. Arrival in 14 minutes. 14 minutes. That was barely enough time to activate emergency protocols, let alone figure out what they were dealing with. You know what's funny about perfect timing? It's usually anything but accidental. Yemex's claws clicked against his console as he opened the standard hailing frequency. His voice, despite years of training, carried just the slightest tremor of uncertainty. Unidentified ship, this is Nexus. Control. You are entering restricted space without authorization. Identify yourself immediately or face interdiction by station security. The response came back faster than light-speed communication should have allowed, as if the unknown vessel had been waiting for exactly this moment. The voice that emerged from the speakers was human, and unmistakably so, but carried an accent that made Yemex's scaled skin crawl with primal unease. Nexus Station, this is Captain Jake Morrison aboard the vessel Retribution. I'm here under diplomatic immunity to present evidence of war crimes committed during the recent conflict. Captain Morrison, the name meant nothing to Yemex, but something about the way it was spoken suggested it should. There was weight behind those words, the kind of gravity that comes from carrying unbearable knowledge. Captain Morrison. ... Nix's voice trailed off as he frantically searched the diplomatic registry. Our records show no human diplomatic vessels scheduled for this sector. Please transmit your credentials and diplomatic authorization codes. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds that felt like an eternity in the cold vacuum of space. My credentials are 47 million dead humans. Morrison's voice carried the weight of a funeral dirge, each word measured and deliberate. I'm here to discuss the war crimes your tribunal conveniently forgot about. The temperature in the control room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Yemex's multiple eyes darted between his screens, trying to process what he was hearing. 47 million dead humans? The War Crimes Tribunal had been thorough, hadn't it? Every atrocity documented, every criminal sentenced. What was this human talking about? But there was something else troubling Yemex. The ship's energy signature was completely unknown. Not just unfamiliar known. After decades of cataloging every type of vessel in the galaxy, he was looking at readings that didn't match any known propulsion system, any recognized weapons array, any documented shield. Configuration. What had the humans been building while the galaxy celebrated peace? 3 levels down. Ambassador Keller was being dragged from his sleep cycle by emergency protocols he hadn't seen activated in over a decade. His scales rippled with involuntary anxiety as he read the preliminary report, his aide thrust into his hands. The human ship was small, barely a destroyer class, but its energy signature was completely unknown. More disturbing was the message now broadcasting on all frequencies throughout the station. To all members of the Galactic Alliance, Captain Morrison's voice echoed through corridors that had never heard such words before. My name is Captain Jake Morrison, survivor of the Kepler 438b massacre. I carry evidence of systematic genocide committed against human colonies by both Alliance and Dominion forces. You celebrated victory while my people's children burned alive. The words hit the station like a physical blow. Maintenance crews stopped their work. Diplomatic staff emerged from their quarters in various states of undress. Even the automated systems seemed to pause, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Keller's mind raced through the implications. Kepler 438b had been classified as an uninhabited mining world in the official records. But Morrison was claiming it had been a massacre of children. Get me the tribunal records. Keller ordered his aide, his voice tight with growing dread. Every file, every witness statement, every piece of evidence. I want to know what we missed. But even as he spoke, Keller suspected they hadn't missed anything. They had ignored it. There's a difference between oversight and willful blindness, and the ambassador was beginning to fear which category their tribunal fell into. The station fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems. In the diplomatic quarters, emergency sessions were being called. Security chiefs were scrambling to assess the threat level of a single human ship. Intelligence officers were trying to figure out how a supposedly primitive species had developed. technology they couldn't identify. And in the docking bay, something unprecedented was happening. The Retribution settled into its berth with mechanical precision, its hull scarred by years of service, but its systems humming with deadly efficiency. The airlock cycled with a hiss that sounded almost like a soar, perhaps a promise. Captain Jake. Morrison stepped onto Nexus Station, carrying nothing but a quantum storage device, and the fury of a species pushed too far. He was taller than most humans in the galactic database, his gray hair and weathered face telling stories of survival that no official record contained. His blue eyes swept the docking bay with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to expect the worst from every situation. The station security team that met him was impressive 12 beings, from 6 different species, all armed with the latest in non-lethal crowd control technology. They had protocols for handling diplomatic incidents, procedures for managing potentially hostile visitors, and training for dealing with every conceivable threat. They were not prepared for Jake. Morrison. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly across the docking bay, "I'm here under diplomatic immunity to present evidence to your War Crimes Tribunal. I assume you'll want to verify my credentials?" The security chief, a towering Vorthan with ceremonial armor that had seen real battle, stepped forward. "Sir, we have no record of any human diplomatic mission. If you could please." Morrison smiled, and the temperature in the docking bay seemed to drop. "My diplomatic credentials are simple. I represent the 47 million human civilians who were murdered during your war. The ones your tribunal somehow forgot to mention." He held up the quantum storage device, its surface gleaming with data that could reshape galactic history. "This contains the evidence your judges chose to ignore. The locations, the dates, the communications intercepts, the orbital bombardment patterns.
Oh, yeah.
Everything." The security chief's armor plates shifted nervously. "Sir, if you have evidence of war crimes, there are proper channels." "The proper channels," Morrison interrupted, "classified my people as administrative oversights, paperwork errors, clerical mistakes." His voice hardened like steel cooling. "In space, 47 million dead humans, and your tribunal called it a filing error." The silence that followed was deafening. Every being in the docking bay could feel the weight of Morrison's words, the terrible gravity of what he was implying. "The War Crimes Tribunal was thorough," the security chief said weakly. "Every atrocity was documented, every atrocity against species that mattered," Morrison corrected. "Every crime against beings who were considered worthy of justice." He took a step forward, and despite being outnumbered 12 to 1, every security officer took a step back. "But humans. We were too small, too primitive, too insignificant to warrant inclusion in galactic justice." He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. "That was your mistake. The War Crimes Tribunal was about to learn what happens when you ignore humanity. And like so many lessons in life, this one was about to compound in ways no one could have predicted. Speaking of how small oversights can compound into massive consequences, there's another story worth exploring about the incredible power of compounding and how it shapes everything from personal decisions to galactic justice. Check out my next video to discover how this fundamental force can transform your own life. The Emergency Tribunal convened in Nexus Station's maximum security chamber, a room designed to contain the galaxy's most dangerous criminals during their trials. Walls of reinforced transparent aluminum stretched 30 feet high, embedded with neural dampeners that could suppress even the most violent telepathic species. The chamber had witnessed the trials of warlords, sentencing of genocidal dictators, and the final judgments of beings who had terrorized entire star systems. But none of those previous proceedings had prepared the assembled delegates for what they were about to witness. Ambassador Keller entered the chamber with the confident stride of someone who had spent decades navigating galactic politics. His ceremonial armor gleamed under the harsh lights, each scale polished to perfection for what should have been a routine diplomatic incident. Behind him, representatives from 23 worlds took their seats, their various forms creating a living spectrum of galactic diversity. At the center of it all stood Captain Jake Morrison. The human was unlike anything in their cultural databases. Standing over 6 feet tall, his presence seemed to fill the massive chamber, despite being just one being among hundreds. His gray hair was cut with military precision, and his face bore the kind of scars that came from surviving things that should have killed him. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, blue as Earth's oceans, burning with a controlled rage that made even the war-hardened Predator clan representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Captain Morrison," Keller began, his voice carrying the practiced diplomacy of centuries. The war between the Alliance and Dominion was conducted within established galactic law. Neutral parties were protected under treaty provisions that have governed interstellar conflict for over 1,000 years. Morrison's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp, sudden, and painful to hear. Protected. He reached for the quantum storage device at his belt, its surface pulsing with data that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their recent victory. The device activated with a sound like distant thunder, and suddenly the chamber filled with holographic displays that made several delegates gasp in horror. "Tell me, Ambassador," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence, "what was the official status of New Denver Colony?" Keller's aide Nestra consulted her files with trembling tentacles. "Neutral research outpost," she whispered. "Population, 12,000 civilians," as Morrison repeated, and that single word carried more menace than any weapon. "Past tense. Because your honorable war needed resources, and human colonies were inconveniently sitting on them." The hologram shifted, showing orbital bombardment patterns in 3-dimensional detail. The precision was horrifying, not the random destruction of conventional warfare, but the methodical elimination of specific targets: schools, hospitals, residential areas, the kind of surgical strikes that left no room for survivors. "So you decided to remove the inconvenience," Morrison continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow filling every corner of the massive chamber. "You know, what's fascinating about documentation? It has a way of making denial impossible." Keller's scales darkened from silver to charcoal. Physiological response he couldn't control. That was not sanctioned by Alliance High Command. If rogue elements operated outside of rogue elements. Morrison's voice cut through the chamber like a plasma blade, and every delegate could feel the temperature drop. "Oh, but your battle fleets glassed 29 human colonies. The Dominion took 18 more, 47 worlds, 47 million human lives." The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. Morrison began walking slowly around the chamber, making eye contact with each delegate as he spoke. Men, women, children, elderly. Farmers who grew food that fed your relief stations. Scientists who shared their research freely with galactic universities. Children who drew pictures of alien friends they'd never meet, all murdered for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. Several ambassadors were frantically consulting their databases, their faces showing the growing horror of beings who were discovering that their celebrated victory had been built on foundations of genocide. The crystalline hegemony's representative, a being of living diamond, spoke in harmonics that the translators rendered as barely controlled fury. These colonies. They were listed as uninhabited mining worlds in our intelligence reports. "Exactly," Morrison said, his smile colder than the void between stars. Uninhabited. Because it's easier to steal resources from empty worlds than to murder civilians for them. But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. Because this wasn't just about resources. The hologram shifted again, showing communication intercepts. Between Alliance and Dominion forces, the delegates watched in growing horror as their own military leaders discussed the human problem, with the kind of casual indifference usually reserved for discussing the weather. The War Crimes Tribunal was meant to address all atrocities, Keller said weakly, his voice barely audible above the mounting chaos in the chamber. Morrison nodded grimly. It was, but humanity wasn't invited to testify. We were considered too primitive to warrant inclusion in galactic justice. He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in, like a stone dropped into still water. That was your first mistake. The hologram shifted one final time, and suddenly the chamber fell silent. The display showed Morrison's own family, a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, standing next to a small girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The timestamp showed the image was taken just weeks before New Denver Colony ceased to exist. Emma Morrison, the captain said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time since entering the chamber, xenobiologist. She spent her life studying alien cultures because she believed understanding led to peace. She published 17 papers on interspecies cooperation. Your libraries probably still have her research. The little girl in the hologram waved at the camera, her joy infectious even across the years and through the tragedy that followed. Lucy Morrison, 8 years old. She wanted to be a starship captain like her daddy. She collected holos of different alien species and made up stories about adventures they could have together. Morrison's voice grew quieter, more dangerous. She was vaporized when Alliance forces needed the rare minerals beneath their research station. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the neural dampeners couldn't contain the waves of shock and horror washing through the chamber. Your second mistake, Morrison continued. His voice hardening like steel cooling in space was thinking we would forget. He turned to face the full assembly, and every delegate could see the terrible purpose burning in his eyes. You see, there's something every human child learns from the moment they can understand language. We remember everything. Every slight, every injustice, every act of cruelty. We pass those memories down through generations like sacred texts. The quantum storage device pulsed with increasing intensity, and the delegates realized with growing dread that Morrison had shown them only the smallest fraction of what he carried. The Alamo. Pearl Harbor, September 11th. Humanity has a long history of remembering when others thought we were too weak to matter, and now you've given us something new to remember. Morrison's smile was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. 47 million reasons to remember. The implications were staggering. Morrison was telling the truth. If humanity had been systematically excluded from galactic justice while their people were murdered for resources, then everything they thought they knew about their recent victory was built on a lie. But there was something else. Something that made the growing silence even more ominous. Morrison hadn't come alone. The energy signature of his ship suggested technology beyond anything in their databases. And if humanity had been watching, learning, preparing while the galaxy celebrated peace, the War Crimes Tribunal was about to learn what happens when you ignore humanity. And like all the best lessons in life, this one was about to compound in ways that would reshape the galaxy forever. Speaking of how small oversights can compound into massive consequences, there's another story worth exploring about the incredible power of compounding and how it shapes everything from personal decisions to galactic justice. Check out my next video to discover how this fundamental force can transform your own life. The revelation hit the galactic community like a supernova, sending shockwaves that rippled across every inhabited world in known space. Within hours of Morrison's presentation, emergency sessions were being called on planets that hadn't convened urgent councils in decades. The carefully orchestrated celebration of victory was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. On Vorthan Prime, Ambassador Keller's homeworld, the Planetary Council worked through the night as intelligence officers, frantically cross-referenced their war records with Morrison's evidence. What they found made their scales turn the color of ash. Every uninhabited resource extraction site they had targeted during the war had been a thriving human colony. Every strategic mining operation had been a massacre. The crystalline hegemonies, data crystals sang with discordant harmonies as their living computers processed the scope of the cover-up. Both the Alliance and Dominion had quietly agreed to classify human colonies as empty worlds in their official reports, erasing 47 million lives from history with the stroke of a bureaucratic pen. But Captain Morrison was far from finished. With his revelations, you want to know why Earth went silent during your war? he asked the assembled council, his voice carrying the weight of a species that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. Why we stopped responding to your communications? It wasn't weakness, Ambassador, it was preparation. The holographic display shifted, and suddenly the chamber filled with star charts that made every military strategist in the room break out. In cold sweats, red indicators dotted the galaxy like drops of blood, marking locations that shouldn't have existed according to their intelligence networks. While you were fighting each other, while you were dividing up the spoils of your glorious victory, humanity was building. Morrison's finger traced the constellation of red dots, each one representing a mystery that was about to become a nightmare. Every human colony that survived your genocide began construction projects, orbital weapons platforms, defensive networks, warships. You know what's terrifying about underestimating someone? They're usually busy proving you wrong while you're busy congratulating yourself. The implications were staggering. If Morrison was telling the truth, then humanity had spent the last 3 years of the war not cowering in fear, but preparing for something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Keller's worst fears were materializing. Before his eyes, like a slow-motion disaster, Captain Morrison, surely you don't mean to suggest that humanity has been preparing for? I don't suggest anything, Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade forged from pure authority. I'm telling you exactly what's coming. The human colonial government has classified both the Alliance and Dominion as hostile entities. The Galactic Council, by extension, has been deemed complicit in genocide through willful negligence. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes, heavy, ominous, and filled with the promise of destruction. Morrison lifted the quantum device in his hand, its surface pulsing with data that represented years of meticulous intelligence gathering. This contains the location of every military installation, every fleet base, every government facility belonging to species that participated in the murder of my people. It was compiled over 3 years by human intelligence operatives who you never knew existed. The chamber fell deadly silent as the full implications sank in. For 3 years, while the galaxy had been fighting its war and celebrating its victory, humanity had been watching, learning, mapping every weakness, every vulnerability, every secret that could be exploited. Several ambassadors were frantically consulting their security chiefs, demanding to know how human operatives could have penetrated their most secure facilities. The answers they received were uniformly terrifying. Nobody had even known to look for them. How many? The representative from the fungal collective asked, his spores trembling with barely contained panic. How many of your operatives are embedded in our governments? Morrison's smile was answer enough. But then something unexpected happened. The captain's expression softened, and he reached into his jacket to pull out a small photograph the same. An image of his family that had been displayed in the hologram. His weathered fingers traced the edges of the photo with infinite gentleness. But I'm not here for revenge, Morrison continued, his voice taking on a tone that was somehow more frightening than his earlier anger. I'm here to offer you something. Your tribunal never offered humanity a choice. The word hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. After everything they had seen, everything they had learned, the assembled delegates grasped at this unexpected mercy with desperate hope. Morrison looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every ambassador, every representative, every being who had celebrated victory while human children burned. Acknowledge the crimes committed against humanity. Return the stolen worlds to human control. Pay reparations to the families of the dead, and submit to human oversight of your military operations for the next century. The terms were harsh, but not impossible. Expensive, but not bankrupting. Humiliating, but not genocidal. It was, by any measure, a generous offer from a species that had every right to demand complete submission. And if we refuse? Keller asked, though he dreaded the answer even as the words left his lips. Morrison's smile returned, colder than the void of space, and twice as empty. Then you'll discover why every human child learns about the Alamo, Pearl Harbor, and 9/11s in their history classes. We remember, Ambassador. We remember everything. He began walking slowly around the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the silence like a countdown to Judgment Day. You see, there's something unique about human psychology that your xenobiologists never quite understood. We don't just remember trauma, we honor it. We build monuments to it, tell stories about it to our children and our children's children. The quantum device pulsed brighter, and Morrison's voice took on the cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon. The Alamo was a military defeat that became a rallying cry. Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack that awakened a sleeping giant. September 11th was a terrorist attack that unified a divided nation. This time someone thought they had broken us. They instead gave us something more powerful than any weapon. Stopped walking and faced the full assembly. They gave us a reason to remember. The implications were beyond terrifying. If humanity had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, if they had intelligence operatives embedded throughout the galaxy, if they had been building weapons and defenses while pretending to be neutral. How long do we have to decide? Keller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison checked a device on his wrist that none of them recognized. My government gave me authority to negotiate for exactly 72 hours. After that, ... He shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. After that, you'll discover what happens when you try to erase a species from history. The chamber erupted in panicked conversations as delegates tried to contact their home governments, their military leaders, their intelligence agencies. But Morrison wasn't finished. Oh, and one more thing, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Every human colony that survived your genocide, they've been building something special, something your military strategists might find interesting. He activated the quantum device one final time, and the holographic display showed construction projects that defied every known principle of military engineering. Orbital platforms that could move like ships, out. Defensive networks that spanned entire star systems. Weapons that seemed to bend the laws of physics themselves. You thought you were fighting a war, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. You were actually attending a demonstration, and now class is over. War Crimes Tribunal was about to learn what happens when you ignore humanity. And like all the most powerful forces in the universe, this lesson was about to compound in ways that would reshape the galaxy forever. Speaking of how small actions can compound into world-changing forces, there's another story worth exploring. About the incredible power of compounding and how it shapes everything from personal decisions to galactic justice. Check out my next video to discover how this fundamental force can transform your own life. The ultimatum spread across the galaxy. Faster than light itself, carried by quantum communication networks that reached every inhabited world within hours. Morrison's 72-hour deadline wasn't just a diplomatic message. It was a ticking bomb that would reshape the balance of power in the known universe. The response was swift, predictable, and catastrophically arrogant. Emergency sessions convened on every major world as governments that had been enemies just months before suddenly found themselves united by something more powerful than any previous alliance: wounded pride. The Alliance and Dominion, despite having fought a 7-year war that had cost billions of lives, discovered they had more in common than they'd ever imagined when faced with what they saw as an upstart species demanding respect. How dare they? Thundered General Vex of the Dominion War Council, his cybernetic implants sparking with rage. A primitive species that couldn't even defend its own colonies now threatens us. The Alliance leadership was equally incensed. Supreme Commander Thesis, whose tactical brilliance had won the recent war, paced the floor of the emergency session like a caged predator. These humans withdraw from our conflict, claim neutrality when things get difficult, and now demand we bow to their will? It's inconceivable. Ambassador Keller was among the few voices calling for negotiation, his scaled face grave with the understanding that Morrison's evidence was undeniable. The human claims are substantiated, he argued before. The joint session. We cannot ignore the systematic elimination of 47 million civilians. Perhaps we should consider... Consider what? Interrupted Chancellor Core of the hegemony. Allowing the blackmail from a species that can't even field a proper fleet? Never. The joint session of the Galactic Council that followed was a masterclass in political theater, Representatives from 234 worlds cast their votes with the kind of dramatic flourish usually reserved for declaring wars or crowning emperors. The final tally was devastating in its one-sidedness. 234-7, rejecting humanity's demands they would not be blackmailed by a species they considered beneath their notice. You know what's funny about unanimous decisions? They're usually wrong. Captain Morrison received the news while still aboard Nexus Station, standing in the same chamber where he had presented his evidence. The message arrived through official diplomatic channels, stamped with the seals of governments that had just signed their own death warrants. Morrison read the rejection once, folded the document with mechanical precision, and walked to the communication console. His weathered fingers moved across the controls with the steady purpose of a man who had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. He transmitted a single word back to Earth: execute. The word traveled through quantum space faster than thought itself, reaching human colonies, hidden bases, and sleeper agents embedded throughout the galaxy. What happened next defied every principle of military strategy that the assembled galactic powers thought they understood. The attacks began simultaneously across 15 sectors, coordinated with a precision that should have been impossible across such vast distances. Human ships, sleek, deadly, and unlike anything in the galactic databases, emerged from hyperspace with surgical timing that spoke of years of careful planning. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't the random acts of vengeance that the galactic leadership had expected. The Alliance High Command bunker on Keller's homeworld, the fortress that had withstood Dominion siege weapons for 3 years, was vaporized in the first hour, not by overwhelming firepower, but by weapons that seemed to ignore conventional defenses entirely. One moment the bunker existed, the next it was simply gone, leaving behind only a perfectly spherical crater and the terrified survivors who had been outside its walls. The Dominion's Fleet Command Center on Terminus Station suffered an even more impossible fate. It simply vanished. Not destroyed, not damaged, but gone as if it had never existed. Security footage showed the massive structure 1 second and empty space the next. The only evidence it had ever been there was the confused radio chatter from nearby vessels asking where their command center had gone. Military installations that had coordinated the attacks on human colonies found themselves under siege by enemies who knew their every weakness. Defense systems that had never been penetrated suddenly failed. Secure communication networks that had never been compromised began broadcasting human children singing lullabies. Weapons that had never malfunctioned turned on their own operators. But the most terrifying aspect of humanity's war wasn't its advanced technology or impossible precision. It was its restraint. Civilian areas were completely untouched. Trade routes remained open and functional. The galactic economy continued to operate without disruption. Hospital ships moved freely between systems. Refugee camps received regular supply deliveries. The humans were demonstrating something that chilled military strategists to their cores. They could destroy their enemy's ability to wage war without becoming monsters themselves. How? Keller demanded of his surviving military advisors, his scales now permanently darkened with stress. How did they coordinate such precise strikes across the entire galaxy? How did they know exactly where to hit us? The answer came from an unexpected source. His aide Nestra, who had been quietly analyzing the attack patterns, spoke up from the corner of the emergency bunker where they had taken refuge. "The research colonies," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones we thought were just mining operations. They weren't extraction sites." She activated a holographic display showing the locations of the destroyed human colonies. Overlaid with the current attack pattern, the correlation was perfect, terrifying, and undeniable. They were listening posts, observation stations. For 3 years, while we ignored them, dismissed them as irrelevant, they were watching us, learning our communication protocols, mapping our defense networks, recording our tactical patterns. Keller stared at the display as understanding dawned. Like a cold sunrise, the human colonies hadn't been neutral research outposts caught in the crossfire of someone else's war. They had been intelligence-gathering stations, positioned perfectly to observe both Alliance and Dominion military operations. The humans weren't neutral in our war, he said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. They were. Studying it, learning from it, preparing for their own. As if summoned by his words, the main screen flickered to life. Captain Morrison's image appeared, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, through the viewport of his vessel, the lights of human warships could be seen holding perfect formation against the stars. Ships that moved like they were alive, that seemed to bend space around them, that hummed with technologies. Beyond galactic understanding, the War Crimes Tribunal reconvenes in 72 hours, Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just proven that humanity was far from the primitive species the galaxy had dismissed. This time, humanity will have a seat at the table. This time, justice will be served for all victims of your conflict. He paused, his expression softening as he looked down at the photo of his family that he still carried. His weathered fingers traced the edges of the image with infinite gentleness. This is still your choice, Ambassador. End this with honor. Acknowledge what was done to my people, and help us build a galaxy where children of all species can grow up in peace. Or continue this path and watch your governments fall to a species you thought too weak to matter. Transmission cut to another view, showing Admiral Rebecca Hayes on the bridge of the lead battleship. The woman was younger than Morrison, but her eyes held the same weight of loss and determination. The human colonies of New Denver, Kepler 438b, and 45 other worlds demand justice, she said, her voice carrying across space like a promise carved in stone. Their children's voices will be heard, whether in a court of law or on a battlefield. Of your choosing, the transmission ended, leaving the emergency bunker in stunned silence. Outside, through the reinforced windows, the lights of human ships could be seen holding perfect formation against the stars, patient as death itself. The war they thought had ended was indeed over. The Dominion had been defeated. The Alliance had claimed victory, and the galaxy had celebrated peace. But humanity's war for justice had just begun, and the galaxy would never forget the lesson. Never underestimate a species that remembers its dead, honors its fallen, and refuses to let genocide go unpunished. In the end, 47 million human lives had taught the galaxy something profound about the power of memory, the strength of determination, and the way small acts of injustice can compound into forces that reshape the universe itself. Speaking of how small actions can compound into world-changing forces, there's another story worth exploring about the incredible power of compounding and how it shapes everything from personal decisions to galactic justice. Check out my next video to discover how this fundamental principle can transform your own life in ways you never imagined.